Hi everyone, my name is Morgan McFarland, and today I'm going to be talking with you about the relation of accidents to the issuance of regulations. So let's jump right in. So as an overview today, we're going to be talking about three accidents in particular. The one major one is the Colgan Air Flight 3407. And its subsequent regulations, including the Airline Safety and FAA Extension Act of 2010, including the 1,500-hour rule that was included in that. Some supporting accidents from that that also kind of led to the Airline Safety Act were Air France Flight 447, as well as Pinnacle Airlines Flight 3701. So we're talking through, giving a summary of each of those and what happened. We'll find some commonalities in between each of these, including inadequate pilot training, as well as non-compliance with standard procedures. And then we'll finish out with some biblical perspective on the topic. So starting out here with the Colgan Air Flight 3407 accident. In summary, on approach in icing conditions, the aircraft began to stall, activating the stick shaker. The stick shaker was a component of the aircraft that was supposed to warn the pilot of an impending stall, and the recovery from that is to push forward on the stick shaker. However, in this case, the captain pulled backwards. That aggravated the stall, was not proper recovery of the stall, and then led to the accident. So some probable causes of this accident were the opposite or inappropriate response to the stick shaker by the captain, as well as the underlying causes of pilot fatigue. The first officer made it very clear that she was commuting all the way from Seattle to the East Coast, and she basically just didn't have the rest that was required to operate the aircraft safely. The crew also failed to adhere to sterile cockpit procedures. So what this procedure basically says is that no unrelevant conversation that doesn't have anything to do with the flight is supposed to happen in the cockpit below 10,000 feet. However, the pilot or the two pilots continued their conversation throughout the entire flight, which is against regulation. Also, the airline did not review any type of experience of the pilots. It was later found that the captain had failed several of his examinations specifically for stall recoveries. So the argument was made after this investigation was completed that if there was a pilot records source, that the airline could have looked at those records and seen that the pilot was not very qualified to be able to operate these flights safely. So in this next slide, we're going to see a video that sort of gives another summary of all of the regulations associated with Colgan Air Flight 3407. So let's jump right in.
It's a scene now familiar for anyone who's wearing red and working for change in airline safety. On February 12, 2009, a Colgan Air commuter flight was flying from Newark, New Jersey to Buffalo when it crashed into a home in Clarence. By the time daylight struck, investigators were already putting together a troubling picture. The pilots, inexperienced and fatigued, weren't properly trained on how to land in icy conditions. As they made their descent, the plane crashed just 3 miles from the airport. A year after the crash, Congress passed the Airline Safety Act. The law increased pilot training hours and requires more training for flying in bad weather. It also set up new rest rules between flights and established a database of pilot records. Since it went into effect in 2010, there hasn't been a single major crash of a U.S. airline. Experts credit the victims' families. For 10 years, they made countless trips to Washington to make sure a tragedy like the crash of Flight 3407.
And the end of that video was supposed to say the crash of Flight 3407 never happened again. So as seen in the video, the major piece of regulation that was issued after the Colgan Air flight was the Airline Safety and Federal Aviation Administration Extension Act of 2010. This was signed into public law in 2010, and it had 4 major sections. The first one was pilot training hours, which affected 14 CFR Part 61, 121, 135, 141, and 142. So each of those are just sets of regulations that apply to aviation, particularly for pilot qualifications. Previously, before this act was enacted, the minimums for an ATP pilot or an airline transport pilot was 250 hours, which is the minimum for any commercial pilot at this point. After this act, since it was seen that the pilots of Colgan Air 3407 were found to be very inexperienced, the hourly experience limit was increased to 1,500 hours. There are some exceptions given for it, but majority is 1,500 hours. The next section that was given was an increase in pilot training for bad weather. This and another accident that we're going to be talking about particularly deals with stalls in thunderstorms, icing conditions, any type of bad weather that pilots generally aren't going to be flying in previously from their airline career. So this act said it found the benefit in increasing that training before they got into the bad weather so that they would know how to operate. The third section was pilot fatigue and rest requirements. So this basically set out CFR Part 117, which gave a lot of requirements for rest of the pilots, specifically because the first officer was so fatigued. So being fatigued as a pilot or as a person in general severely decreases your performance and your decision making, which is never a good thing in the cockpit. So Part 117 outlines a lot of the different rules for 121 pilots as far as when they are in a rest period, when they're on duty, what is happening while they are commuting, anything like that. So if you're interested in that, I'm not going to read you all of the regulations right now, but look it up. It's pretty interesting. It's pretty fun. And then the final section is the pilot records database. So this was fully put forward last year on August 9th. And basically what it is a collection in an online database of any pilot records. So it includes any pilot certificates, medical certificates, any violations of aviation regulations. It has your driver's record, any accident or incident information, pre-employment drug screening, anything like that. So anything that has to do with your pilot training to be able to help a hiring process to increase the safety of aviation based on your previous performance. And then we're going to talk about a little bit more into this 1,500 hour rule. So on this next slide, we're going to be talking about that here in a moment. So the previous regulation for an airline transport pilot was 250 hours. After this crash and after this act was given, it increased to 1,500, which is a pretty big jump, particularly in the world that we live in today, right after COVID. We are now living in a pilot shortage. The estimate is 265,000 pilots needed in the next decade, which is a lot. There's quite the demand and not really a lot of supply of pilots. So the argument has been made that the 1,500 hour rule should be decreased. Some of the arguments say that there have been exceptions made for college graduates and military pilots. Why can't that be given to other people? So in these cases, military pilots can qualify for ATP at 750 hours, as well as college graduates at 1,000 or 1,250, depending on their credit hours that they have taken. Another argument is that the experience that pilots generally build is in small planes, and that experience doesn't help them prepare for a jet operation that you would have in an airline. So those are kind of the perspective that we're coming from. And I see that side. I also see the other side, that building experience is essential to aviation safety, which we have seen in the Colgan Air flight. As the video stated, no major airline accidents have occurred since the regulation from the Airline Safety Act was given. But at the same time, getting 1,500 hours is very time consuming and expensive. So in order to find kind of a common ground, we sort of just have to find a middle ground in between. That could happen sooner, could happen later. I think something has to happen in between for that to occur. But I do believe it's possible to be able to feel confident to be able to operate a jet aircraft well at 1,000 hours. Personally, that is what I will be doing. I qualify for the restricted ATP at 1,000. And from my current experience level, I feel like I would be able to do that well. So I can see the argument from lowering the time, not all the way to 250 hours, but maybe to 1,000 for those who qualify. So one of the flights that also supported this act, the Airline Safety Act 2010, was Air France Flight 447, which occurred in June of 2009. What happened in this was it was an international flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, and the pilots flew basically into a thunderstorm in a turbulent area. The pitot tubes froze over, and then gave conflicting information about the airspeed. So this was very surprising and confusing to the pilots at 35,000 feet because everything is usually very stable at that point in cruise. So it was surprising. They failed to notice the decreasing airspeed and the impending stall, and then they basically just didn't recover from the stall because they were confused and lacked the understanding for it. So probable causes for this were the lack of high altitude stall recovery training, as well as poor management of the emergency due to the lack of understanding. Our last accident is going to be Pinnacle Airlines Flight 3701. Basically what happened in this flight, it was a transfer flight, so there weren't any passengers aboard, it was only the two pilots. And the two pilots wanted to try to have some fun and test the limits of the aircraft, so they flew up to 41,000 feet, which was the surface ceiling of the aircraft. and tried to test the limits. What that did was cause a aerodynamic stall from which the pilots were unable to recover. So some probable causes of this accident was the unprofessionalism of the pilots trying to have the attitude of, okay, let's see what we can do with this thing. Normally in like the 20s and 30s, that led to some great discoveries. However, in this case, definitely an unprofessional attitude to have. They also lacked the knowledge of core lock, which was what happened with the failure of the engines, as well as stalls at a high altitude like that. So some commonalities that we can see within each of these accidents is inadequate pilot training. So in Colgan Air, the captain repeatedly failed several tests, as well as they were unable to recognize and recover from the stall. That was the biggest part in each of these accidents, is flying in icing conditions or non-icing conditions, getting into a stall, and then ultimately crashing the airplane. Either not recognizing the stall or just not being able to recover from it. As well as the lack of training review before hiring. So that again led to the pilot records database, which is going to really help increase aviation safety later. Another commonality we can see is non-compliance with standard procedures. So in Colgan Air, we saw the lack of sterile cockpit, so making sure that we're really focused on what's happening. In all three accidents, it was shown that checklist usage really wasn't used properly, as well as the unprofessionalism of testing the limits of the aircraft. At times that is encouraged, but in this case definitely was not appropriate. So how does that apply to us as Christians as well? The biggest thing that I saw in each of these was trying to be prepared for anything, because an accident can happen at any time, and being able to deal with the accident appropriately. So that applies to Christians as well, particularly with the coming of our Lord. So 1 Peter 1:13 says, therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed in his coming. The next one, Matthew 24:44, so you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. So just like an accident, even though that is tragic and coming of Christ is going to be amazing, we don't know when that's going to happen. So we have to do everything that we can, being alert, being fully sober, putting our hope in Christ, and ultimately sharing the gospel, doing everything that we can to prepare for his coming, because we really don't know when that's going to happen. Paul also reminds us in 1 Corinthians 9:24, do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. So in context with this, Paul is basically saying, keep fighting, keep running the race. You don't know what's going to happen. So keep trying, keep training, keep your training up as pilots as well as Christians, so that you can eventually win the prize and be in the presence of the Lord. So in conclusion, aviation accidents are tragic occurrences that bring about learning and legislation to better aviation safety. We saw that specifically through the Airline Safety Act of 2010 and the 4 different categories that it brought about. Colgan Air Flight 3407 brought about new regulations for pilot qualifications in time as well as in record keeping. It brought about new regulations concerning pilot fatigue and rest, as well as more in-depth training for pilots. Air France Flight 447 and Pinnacle Airlines 3701 were also examples of the need for these changes, these regulations. And just as pilots need to stay prepared, and train well, Christians should also do the same. So thank you everyone for listening, and I really enjoyed going through this class with all of you. Hope you have a great night.